The auction block in Santa Fe stood in the dusty plaza like a monument to human cruelty, its wooden planks weathered gray by sun and stained dark by countless tragedies. Thomas Brennan watched from across the square, his weathered hands clenched into fists inside his coat pockets as the auctioneer's voice rang out over the crowd. At 62 years old, Thomas had seen plenty of ugliness in his life, 30 years riding cattle trails from Texas to Montana, 20 years before that fighting in wars that seemed pointless now. But this spectacle before him churned his stomach in ways that battlefields never had. Two Apache girls stood on that platform, chained at the ankles, their dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd as if refusing to acknowledge the horror of their situation. The older one might have been 19 or 20, tall and defiant despite the chains, her chin raised in silent rebellion. The younger couldn't have been more than 16, slight and trembling, pressed close to her sister as though proximity alone could protect them from what was coming. The auctioneer, a fat man in a stained waistcoat, gestured at them like livestock. Strong workers, both of them. The older one can cook, clean, skilled with horses. The younger one is quick to learn and biddable. Sold as a pair, gentlemen, and what a pair they are. We'll start the bidding at $200. Thomas felt rage build in his chest like steam in a boiler. The so-called Indian Wars had ended years ago, but their aftermath lingered in practices like this, legal in the gray areas where territorial law met federal authority and human decency disappeared entirely. Girls taken during raids or removed from reservations under dubious paperwork, sold into what amounted to slavery under the euphemism of domestic service contracts. Everyone knew what really happened to most of these girls, worked to death on remote ranches or worse, and everyone looked the other way. The bidding started slowly. A rancher Thomas recognized offered $220, more interested in cheap labor than anything else. A mine owner countered with $250. Then a man Thomas didn't know, dressed too well for honest work, bid $300, and Thomas saw the older girl's defiance crack for just a moment, fear bleeding through her carefully maintained mask. He knew that type of man, knew what he wanted with two young Apache girls, and something in Thomas Brennan's conscience, a conscience he'd thought long dead, suddenly roared to life. $500, Thomas heard himself say, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Every head turned toward him. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. $500 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear $550? The well-dressed man's eyes narrowed as he studied Thomas, calculating whether this was worth a fight. Thomas stared back steadily, his hand resting on the carved handle of the Colt revolver he still wore despite his retirement from the cowboy life. He'd built a reputation over 3 decades, most of it earned through honest work but enough of it ridden in gunsmoke that men thought twice before crossing him. The well-dressed man apparently decided this wasn't his day. He turned and walked away without another bid. $500 once, twice, sold to Mr. Brennan. The auctioneer's gavel cracked down like a gunshot. Thomas paid with money he'd been saving to expand his small ranch outside town, money that represented 2 years of careful scrimping. The transaction was conducted with cold efficiency, papers signed and stamped, the girls' ownership transferred as casually as if they were horses or furniture. The auctioneer handed Thomas the key to their ankle chains and a sheaf of documents that made his stomach turn. 30-year service contract, the man said cheerfully. Renewable at your discretion. They're yours to do with as you see fit, within reason of course. Thomas took the papers without comment and crossed to where the girls stood on the platform. Up close, he could see the marks of hardship written on their faces, the hollowness of poor rations, the bruises of rough handling, the wariness of creatures who had learned to expect only cruelty from the world. He unlocked their chains, the metal falling away with a clatter that made the younger girl flinch. Can you understand English? Thomas asked quietly. The older girl nodded once, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of defiance and calculation. She was trying to figure him out, trying to determine what new hell she and her sister had just been sold into. My name is Thomas Brennan. I have a ranch about 5 miles from here, small place, just me and some cattle and horses. I'm going to take you there, and then we need to have a conversation about what happens next. But first, I figure you're probably hungry. There's a restaurant over on the next street run by a Mexican woman named Rosa who doesn't ask questions and makes the best tamales in New Mexico. That sound acceptable to you? The girl stared at him as if he'd started speaking Apache, which Thomas actually could do a little, picked up over years of trading and occasionally fighting with various tribes. The younger girl whispered something urgently to her sister in their own language, too fast for Thomas to follow. "You really just want to feed us?" the older girl finally asked, her English accented but clear. "That, and get you out of this plaza before someone decides to make trouble. I've got a wagon around the corner. Come on." They followed him because they had no choice, Thomas knew, not because they trusted him. Why would they? He was just another white man in a territory that had given them nothing but grief. But they walked without chains now, and when he helped them up into his wagon, he saw the younger girl rub her ankles where the metal had chafed, a small gesture of relief that made Thomas feel like maybe his $500 had bought something more valuable than he'd intended. Rosa's restaurant was quiet at midday, just a few regulars nursing coffee and conversation in the corners. Rosa herself took one look at the Apache girls and then at Thomas, and her dark eyes softened with understanding. She'd been a refugee once herself, fled north from revolutions and violence in Mexico, and she recognized the particular desperation of people who'd been treated as less than human. "What do they like to eat?" she asked Thomas in Spanish. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "Whatever you think best. And plenty of it." Rosa brought out dishes of rice and beans, fresh tortillas, chicken cooked with chilies and tomatoes, sweet corn tamales, and a pitcher of cool water. The girls ate slowly at first, testing whether this was some kind of trick, then with increasing hunger as they realized the food kept coming and no one was going to take it away. Thomas nursed a cup of coffee and watched them, trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do now. He'd acted on impulse, something the old Thomas who'd fought Comanches and rustlers would have recognized but that the retired Thomas had thought he'd outgrown. $500 to save two girls he didn't know from a fate he could only imagine. Noble, maybe, but also complicated in ways he hadn't thought through. He couldn't just turn them loose, they'd be picked up by the authorities or worse within a day. The paperwork he carried said they were his property for 30 years, a thought that made him sick. But that same paperwork also meant he was responsible for them, and Thomas Brennan had never in his life shirked a responsibility once undertaken. The ride to Thomas's ranch passed in tense silence, the two girls sitting in the back of the wagon while Thomas guided the horses along the dusty road. His property sat in a valley between two ridges, good grazing land with a creek running through it year-round. The house was modest, 2 rooms and a loft, built solid from pine logs he'd cut himself. There was a barn, a corral with a dozen horses, and cattle scattered across the hillsides bearing his brand, a simple TB inside a circle. He helped the girls down from the wagon and led them inside. The house was clean but sparse, the home of a man who'd lived alone for 15 years since his wife died of fever. Thomas gestured to the 2 chairs at his rough-hewn table. "Sit down," he said gently. "We need to talk." The older girl sat warily, pulling her sister down beside her. Thomas poured 3 cups of water from his pitcher and set them on the table before taking his own seat across from them. "First things, names. I'm Thomas, but most folks call me Tom. What do I call you too?" The older girl studied him for a long moment before answering. "I am Nayland. This is my sister, Desba. Our names mean something in our language, but I will not tell you what unless I know you will not mock them." "Fair enough. Nayland and Desba." Thomas took a sip of water, organizing his thoughts. "I expect you're wondering why I bought you and what I plan to do with you. Truth is, I didn't have much of a plan beyond keeping you away from that bastard who was bidding against me. But I've been thinking on the ride out here, and here's what I propose." He pulled the contract papers from his coat and set them on the table between them. "These papers say you belong to me for 30 years. It's legal, signed by a territorial judge, enforceable by law. It's also the most immoral thing I've ever held in my hands, and I've held plenty of immoral things. Here's what I'm going to do with them." Thomas struck a match and touched it to the corner of the papers. The girls gasped as flames consumed the contract, eating through the words that bound them until there was nothing left but ash. Thomas swept the ashes off the table onto the floor. "No papers, no contract, no ownership. You're free to go whenever you want. But before you run off, let me make you an offer. This ranch needs help. I'm getting older, and there's more work than one man can handle properly. I could use help with the horses, the cooking, the garden, general upkeep. I'll pay you wages, same as I'd pay any hired hands, plus room and board. You can save your money, and when you've got enough to go wherever you want to go, you go with my blessing. Or you can stay as long as you like. Your choice either way. Nayland stared at the ashes on the floor, then back at Thomas, her expression caught between disbelief and suspicion. Why? She demanded. Why would you do this? You paid $500 for us. Now you burn the papers and offer us wages. This makes no sense. What do you really want? Thomas leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. My wife's name was Emma. She died 15 years back, and we never had children though we tried. The last thing she said to me was, try to leave the world a little better than you found it, Tom. I've been failing at that pretty much every day since. Maybe this is me finally trying to honor her request. Or maybe I'm just a foolish old man who can't stand to see young women sold like cattle. Does it matter? It matters if you are lying, Nayland said bluntly. It matters if this is a trick, if you burned false papers and have real ones hidden somewhere. It matters if you expect other things from us in payment. Thomas felt his face flush. I give you my word, and I was raised to believe a man's word means something. I expect work, nothing more. You want to sleep in the barn rather than in the house, that's your choice. You want one of you to stay awake and keep watch in case I'm lying about my intentions, I understand that too. But I swear on Emma's grave, you're safe here, and you're free here, and that's the truth. The sisters spoke to each other in rapid Apache, arguing in low voices. Thomas caught a few words, his limited understanding picking up, trap, and crazy, and what might have been truth, or lie, he wasn't sure. Finally, Nayland turned back to him. We will stay, she said carefully. For now. We will work, and you will pay us wages, and we will see if your words are true or false. If they are true, perhaps we stay longer. If false. She didn't finish the threat, but her hand moved to her belt where Thomas noticed for the first time she'd somehow acquired a knife, probably lifted from Rose's restaurant. He nearly smiled. These girls were survivors. That's all I ask, Thomas said. Now, you two take the bedroom. There's a bed in there big enough for both of you, and I'll sleep in the loft like I've been meaning to do anyway. Desba, you look about done in. Get some rest. Nayland, if you're willing, I could use help with the evening chores. I need to check on a mare that's due to foal any day, and it would be good to have another set of hands nearby. The weeks that followed established an uneasy routine. The girls worked hard, Thomas had to admit, harder than many men he'd hired over the years. Nayland had a gift with horses that bordered on magical, able to calm even the most fractious animals with patience and soft words. Desba turned out to be an excellent cook once she had access to proper ingredients, combining Apache techniques with Mexican influences from her time in captivity to create meals that made Thomas's simple bachelor fare seem like prison food in comparison. Thomas kept his word scrupulously, paying them fair wages every week, respecting their privacy, treating them as employees rather than property. Slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice it happening, the walls began to come down. Nayland's suspicious glares softened into cautious respect. Desba actually smiled one day when a foal was born healthy and strong. They taught him words in Apache, correcting his pronunciation with increasing amusement at his clumsy attempts. He taught them to read and write English better, spending evenings by lamplight working through old newspapers and the few books he owned. One night, about 2 months after he'd brought them home, Thomas was working on fixing a broken harness when Nayland sat down across from him. She'd been quiet all day, thoughtful in a way that suggested important matters on her mind. Thomas, she said, using his full name which she only did when serious. Desba and I have been talking. We want to understand something. You are a man alone. You have no wife, no children. You have money enough to buy a woman if you wanted, and ways to force obedience if you were that kind of man. But you do none of these things. Why do you choose to be alone? Thomas set down the harness, surprised by the directness of the question. I told you about Emma. After she died, there wasn't anyone who could fill that empty space. And I guess I got used to being alone. Seemed easier than trying to build something new. That is foolish, Nayland said bluntly. Life is not meant to be lived alone. Among my people, a man without family is a man without purpose. You have been kind to us, more kind than any white man we have known. You have honored your word when you could have broken it. This means something. I appreciate that, Thomas said carefully, uncertain where this conversation was leading. Desba and I have Nowhere else to go, Nayland continued. Our village was destroyed. Our family is scattered or dead. The reservation is a place of slow death and despair. We could leave here, try to find our way back to Apache lands, but we would likely be caught and sold again, or worse. Or we can stay here, where we are safe and treated well. But staying as hired workers, as outsiders in your home, this is not comfortable. It is not family. Thomas felt a strange flutter in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Nayland, what are you saying? She leaned forward, her dark eyes serious and intent. In Apache tradition, when a man and woman wish to marry, it is often arranged between families. The man provides gifts, demonstrates he can provide for a wife and children. But we have no family to arrange such things. So I speak plainly. You need a family. We need a home and safety. This could be a transaction, yes, but it could also be more. Among my people, marriages often begin as practical arrangements and grow into something deeper. Love is not required at the start, only respect and commitment. Thomas sat back, stunned. You're proposing marriage. To me, Nayland, I'm twice your age. More than twice. You're a beautiful young woman who could. Who could what? Nayland interrupted sharply. Find a nice Apache man on a reservation where the men are broken by grief and whiskey. Find a white man who would see me as an exotic prize rather than a person. You speak of age, but my grandmother married my grandfather when she was 17 and he was 52, and they were together 40 years until death took them both in the same winter. Age is not the barrier you think it is. And Desba? Thomas asked, his mind reeling. You said, them, earlier. You can't mean. Among my people, it is not uncommon for sisters to marry the same man, especially when resources are scarce and protection is needed. Better to share a good man than to be alone or with a bad one. Desba and I have discussed this. She agrees, though she is shy about such things and asked me to speak for both of us. Thomas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening valley. This was insanity. He was 62 years old, set in his ways, comfortable with his isolation. These girls were young enough to be his granddaughters. What would people in Santa Fe say? What would the law say? New Mexico territorial law prohibited plural marriage, though he knew it happened quietly in remote areas among various cultures. But as he stood there, Thomas found himself thinking about Emma's last words. Leave the world better than you found it. What would Emma think of this proposal? She'd been a practical woman, not given to romantic notions about love conquering all. She'd married Thomas because he was solid and dependable, and love had grown between them over years of shared work and mutual respect. Would this be so different? And there was something else, something he'd been trying not to acknowledge over the past 2 months. He'd grown fond of these girls, not in any improper way, but in the way a lonely man grows fond of life and light returning to his empty house. The sound of their voices, the good meals, the sight of Nayland working with the horses with such natural grace, Desba's quiet humor emerging as she felt safer. The house felt like a home again, not just a place to sleep between long days of work. He turned back to find both sisters watching him now, Desba having emerged from the bedroom where she must have been listening. Her young face was flushed with embarrassment but determined. I can't make this decision tonight, Thomas said slowly. This is too important. But I won't dismiss it out of hand. Give me 3 days to think. Is that fair? Nayland nodded, something like relief crossing her features. That is fair. We will speak no more of it until you are ready. Thomas spent those 3 days in an agony of contemplation. He rode his property line, checking fences and water sources, using the physical work to occupy his hands while his mind churned. He thought about practicalities first, because that was his nature. Money wasn't abundant but sufficient for 3 if they lived carefully. The ranch could support them all. The house would need expansion, more rooms for privacy, but he'd built it once and could build onto it. Then there were the social implications. Santa Fe would gossip, certainly, the old cowboy with 2 young Apache wives. Some would call it scandalous. Others might see it as taking advantage, though anyone who spent 5 minutes with Nayland would realize she was nobody's victim. And some, the ones whose opinions Thomas had always valued, would understand that love and family took many forms. But most importantly, Thomas thought about what he wanted for whatever years remained to him. Did he want to die alone in this house, his body perhaps not found for days or weeks? Or did he want to be part of something living and growing, even if it was unconventional? Did he want to honor Emma's memory by remaining frozen in the past, or by continuing to live and build something good? On the evening of the third day, Thomas called both sisters to sit with him on the porch as the sun set over the valley in shades of gold and crimson. "I've made my decision," he said, his weathered hands clasped together. "But before I tell you, I need to say some things. First, if we do this, it's a real marriage, all of us committed to making it work. I won't have you feeling trapped or obligated. If either of you changes your mind, even after we're wed, you're free to leave with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Second, I'm an old man. I'll likely die long before either of you, and I'll make sure this ranch passes to you when I'm gone. Third, I don't expect miracles. I don't expect instant love or perfect happiness. I expect work and compromise and good days mixed with hard ones. That's what marriage is. Emma taught me that." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "But I've been lonely a long time, and these past months with you here have reminded me that life is meant to be shared. So yes, if you're both still willing, I'll marry you. Both of you. We'll figure out how to make it legal, or at least as legal as possible, and we'll make a family together, whatever that looks like." Nayland smiled, a true smile that transformed her usually serious face. Desba let out a breath she'd been holding and reached for her sister's hand. And Thomas Brennan, retired cowboy, felt the ice around his heart that had been there for 15 years finally begin to thaw. The wedding happened a month later, performed by a sympathetic priest in a small Mexican village across the territorial border where questions weren't asked and traditions were more flexible. Father Miguel blessed both marriages in a single ceremony, his aged hands joining Thomas first to Nayland and then to Desba, his words in Latin and Spanish invoking God's blessing on this unusual union. They returned to the ranch as husband and wives, and slowly built the life they'd promised each other. Thomas expanded the house, adding rooms and a proper kitchen. Nayland and Desba transformed the property, planting extensive gardens, improving the horse breeding operation, bringing efficiency and beauty to spaces that had been merely functional. They taught Thomas more Apache traditions, and he taught them the skills of ranching and business. To Thomas's surprise, love did come, different from what he'd shared with Emma but no less real. It grew in shared sunrises and late-night conversations, in the brush of Nayland's hand as she passed him coffee, in Desba's delighted laughter when the first vegetables sprouted in her garden. It grew in the respect and partnership that developed between three people committed to making an impossible situation work. When Nayland became pregnant 2 years later, followed by Desba 6 months after that, Thomas cried for the first time since Emma's death. 2 sons were born, strong and healthy, growing up in a house full of love and 3 different cultural traditions woven together into something entirely new. The people of Santa Fe gossiped, as Thomas had known they would, but gradually the talk faded. What mattered more than gossip was that the Brennan Ranch prospered, that Thomas Brennan, who had been a hard and lonely man, seemed transformed into someone lighter and happier, that the 2 Apache women he'd supposedly bought for servitude were clearly partners in every sense of the word. Thomas lived another 23 years after that auction in Santa Fe, long enough to see his sons grown and married themselves, long enough to dandle grandchildren on his knees and teach them about horses and honor and the importance of doing right even when it's inconvenient. When he finally died at 85, he went peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family, his last sight the faces of the 2 women he'd bought to free and ended up loving instead. Nayland and Desba ran the ranch together for another 30 years after Thomas's death, expanding it into one of the most successful horse breeding operations in New Mexico. They never remarried, telling anyone who asked that they'd had their great love and didn't need another. The house they'd built with Thomas became a refuge for other Apache people displaced by the grinding machinery of territorial expansion, a place where traditions were preserved and new possibilities imagined. And sometimes, sitting on the porch they'd expanded 3 times over the years, watching the sun set over the valley, the 2 sisters would remember that day in Santa Fe, standing chained on an auction block, certain their lives were ending. They'd remember a weathered old cowboy with one good eye who'd paid $500 not for servants or concubines but for the chance to leave the world a little better than he'd found it. And they'd smile, knowing they'd helped him do exactly that.